should probably check. Yep. Sweet. So we are live. Welcome, everyone. We are here for episode 47 of This Is Not a Show. It has no title, but we're here in December to give a recap on the year so far in Division III women's basketball and look down the road a little bit. So joining me, as always, is Riley Zayas, and then we also have our first guest ever. This won't be an interview, and we're not turning it into an interview show, but we've got Justin, is it Heinzen?
You got it.
Justin Heinzen. So we're going to jump right in with introductions in case people don't know all of us. Riley, do you want to just say whatever you want to say about yourself?
Right. Yeah. No, Scott, I always appreciate you, setting all this stuff up. For those who don't know me, I run the Scoop on D3 Women's Hoops, which is a Substack newsletter dedicated to covering D3 women's basketball. And I'm also, like Scott, a D3hoops.com women's basketball top 25 voter. So between those two things, it keeps me pretty busy over the course of the season.
Sweet. Justin?
Yeah, I'm taking a year. Well, I was coaching college basketball on the women's side for the last 18 years, 16 of which at Loras, and stopped this past year and kind of grew envious of your guys' work last year and sort of threw myself in the mix of that. But certainly follow a ton with Midwest stuff and have really good acclimation there. So.
And I'm Scott. I went to Hope, which is my first kind of look into Division III, and men's basketball and women's basketball were extremely strong while I went there, and just love following the game and crunching the numbers. So our contents for today, which we may or may not stick closely to, we're going to talk about scheduling trends. I feel like there's some trends this year in scheduling, and we'll look at some data around that. We're going to look at newcomers to see which teams might look differently than we thought that they were going to look, even once we saw rosters. We're going to do some random stats. Gotta love it. And then we're going to finish off by doing a quick breeze through of what I have projected as the regional rankings. So let's get rolling. So first off is scheduling trends. I'm curious if either of you, if it feels different this year, as far as the games that teams are playing or what we've been seeing early in the year related to scheduling.
Yeah, I mean, Scott, it's been interesting because I think we see these tournaments, pretty common to see those first 2 weekends of the season, kind of dominated by those 4-team tournaments. And I feel like, most schools did a really good job this year of getting some good programs together. I mean, one that obviously comes to mind is that Scholars Classic up at NYU. We got 4 really good programs together. And I think, we're starting to see more of those coming about. There were certain things, though, where I thought, a lot of teams just stuck to kind of what we saw from them last year, honestly, with a lot of, pretty quality, matchups in non-conference. But obviously things depend on when their conference schedule starts and all those other things as well, those other factors that play into things, which I'm sure Justin can comment a little bit more on. But I have been impressed by the scheduling from a lot of the top teams. When we start to look down the list, there are a lot of teams that, by this point in the season, we're not that far into it, already have a very quality win that we'll be talking about, come Selection Monday. I think that's a real testament probably to, the emphasis placed on strength of schedule and those kinds of things by our selection committees the last couple of years, which have kind of forced the scheduling to be a little bit stronger right out of the gate.
I mean, looking at the top 25 poll, there's 43 teams that received at least one top 25 vote, and only 11 of them are undefeated. It feels like a small number. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it is a small number. I didn't compare it to the week 1 poll and state of things last year, but it feels like there's more losses by even the teams we consider to be the best. So on the scheduling. Oh, Go ahead, Justin.
I think what's interesting, though, you schedule at least a year and a half out. And you're in the Midwest. I'm familiar with like Whitewater and Illinois Wesleyan stacking the slate usually and getting a bunch of them regionally ranked games. But I was impressed early with like a Puget Sound making, I think, 2 trips out to the Great Lakes area to pick up some really big games. I really like the pause schedule. Chicago's schedule is pretty good too. So you do see I think it's not the rich are getting richer, but you do see the top teams regionally. That number is going to be pretty tough to beat in terms of just volume.
Yeah, and it kind of feels like an arms race in a way, and I think we'll hit on some of the implications of it because one team scheduling more difficult does not happen in a vacuum.
Right.
But some of the trends that I looked at, so this is strength of schedule, end of year last year is that first column. So one standard deviation, because the average of everyone's strength of schedule is going to be 500 or close. I can't think of any mathematical oddities that would push it. But one standard deviation last year was 0.055, and it's larger this year. Because obviously the average has to stay the same, but I feel like more teams are scheduling more difficult, which means that some other teams just have to be scheduling easier because they have less access to maybe the mid-tier or upper tier teams that they did last year. And then the number of teams above a current threshold of strength of schedule I was kind of looking at that 550 number, but there's 7 additional teams or 10% more, 9% more above that number this year. And I think last year you really didn't want to be below 510, 515, 520, but I could see you not wanting to be below 550 this year, which feels like a strong number. But if you I've looked at the last 10 Pool C teams in last year, and their average strength of schedule was like 575. So it was really, really strong. And there really wasn't anyone below 555. And so I think 550 is kind of a big number that teams will need to be at. And that second column there is based on my projections. So it's going to change. And who knows, maybe when it's all said and done, it looks really similar to last year. But I found this interesting because I wanted to try to put some numbers to our teams scheduling more difficult.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, because Scott, I think what we're starting to see too, which is interesting to me, and we saw this obviously a little bit last year. It's not too uncommon, right? But I feel like we're seeing some more teams. Justin, you bring up Puget Sound. They are kind of crossing regions and crossing more than one region to go out and get these games, which in a lot of ways it creates some interesting situations with, kind of common opponents in some cases. As we go further along in the season, we see more of these non-conference games play out. I think that's also part of it in a way. I mean, even the last couple of years, teams seem like they stayed a little more regional, at least from what I looked at as a voter. This year, we have quite a few teams. East Texas Baptist being another who isn't in top 25 consideration right now, but they go out to Virginia, play at Christopher Newport, and play Elizabethtown as well out there. Then they go to California the following week. We're seeing more of those kinds of things, I think, coming about this year than we were last year, or obviously the year before with COVID and everything that was still affecting with certain teams scheduling and their budgets and everything like that as well.
That's a good point. I think with how the committee did things a year ago, that's the foolproof way to do it. You play in a region ranked game out of region. You don't get blocked if you drop it, but still have the chance to pick up a regional ranked win. And you saw in the bracket last year a ton of cross-region games. I think every pod had not the familiar faces, so that was kind of cool to see. And keeping with that with scheduling, I think that's a good point, Riley.
I talked to one coach in the offseason who said that they had specifically targeted in-region games because they felt that they were a stronger team in region than a lot of the other teams in region, and they wanted that common opponents record to look as good as possible. And that's something they did not have last year, and it could have been a factor in them being ranked a couple spots lower in the region. Right. I thought that was interesting because you're totally right, Justin, that if you play against another likely to be ranked team in your region and you lose it, they've got a head-to-head, a 1-0 VRO versus you an 0-1. It's a lot of stuff going against you that will probably be hard to overcome to get you ranked above them in the region. But yeah, it's all interesting. So along with strength of schedule, because I do think the top teams are going to have scheduled more difficult than we've seen in the past. I think that will, when I crunch the numbers at the end of the year, I think that's going to be the case. So some of the implications is what we thought as a standout strength of schedule in past years might no longer be so. So 550, 560, that might be almost enough to get you into the conversation. Whereas last year, it almost might have been a little point in your favor, right? Hey, you had a 560 and someone else had a 535, or, whatever the numbers are. So I think standout could be a little bit different. But then, teams can't push their strength of schedule endlessly higher. As you saw from this slide, there's actually I project fewer above 625. And so there's more teams above 550 or 575, but I think they're a little bit more concentrated. So it could mean that once you have scheduled that difficult, everyone kind of looks the same. Everyone's going to have an SOS between 560 and 590 or something. And it then means that your winning percentage could become almost relatively more important because everyone's on the same level at this point, which is kind of, I guess, could be easy on the committees. If everyone is really close in one metric, you don't have to compare wildly different resumes. And so I wonder, if you have a high winning percentage and also a 560, 570 SOS, that's probably a slam dunk anyway you sliced it. But I guess I don't really know what my point is. I know that last year Rochester didn't get in with the winning percentage under 700. I would guess that winning percentages under 700 are also not going to get in. And with more teams with an SOS above 550, even if everyone is playing a tougher schedule and likely to have lower winning percentages, there still might be more teams with winning percentages over 700, 710, 720, and also that strength of schedule over 550.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think what you're going to see too is kind of some interesting deals when it comes to who's on the table. Obviously, when they are going about, finding out who's going to be in those last few pool C spots. Last year, kind of what we were debating, and you'll have this debate every year, but you have these really high win percentage teams to have a much lower strength of schedule. And then obviously the vice versa, where like a Rochester, where your strength of schedule is incredible, but your win percentage is very low. I think in both cases, it seems like teams are nearing a little bit more of a middle this year, especially where, they're going to have a decent win percentage, but they're also going out and challenge themselves enough. So they're not hanging their hat on one criteria over the other, right? And we saw that with some teams last year who they really needed the committee to value strength of schedule extremely highly for them to have a chance to get in. I think teams, and coaching staffs maybe are taking a little bit more of a thought towards that and saying, okay, well, why don't we go out and get ourselves some tough games, but balance this out as well to give ourselves some wins, give ourselves a win percentage that can, keep us highly regionally ranked and in that conversation for Pool C if it comes to that.
There was a couple teams in the WIAC, and WIAC teams almost always have a really strong strength of schedule. There was a couple WIAC teams who had scheduled Northland in non-conference, and Northland is not going to be a strong team this year. But those games ended up being canceled. And so we're kind of wondering, hey, would these WIAC teams want to replace that weak opponent with a stronger non-conference opponent? And my analysis of the situation was, well, the WIACs already have a really strong SOS. Almost the way that they don't get in, and we're talking Stout, Oshkosh, Stevens Point, Platteville, River Falls, is if they don't have a winning percentage over 700. And so because of where their strength of schedule sits, they need a win more than they need to play a team that's going to add an extra 3 or 4 points to their overall strength of schedule. And so it's important for teams to know where they fall on that. If you're, say, Skidmore and a week non-conf falls off of your schedule, they need to book as strong a non-conference as they can find, because it's their SOS that's lacking. I expect them to have a pretty strong winning percentage. And it's all about kind of evening the resume out and making sure no piece of criteria looks really bad. Because that's a good question for you, Justin. Like, do you think that having a really bad piece of a resume hurts you more than having a really good piece helps you?
Well, I was on the rack. They switched away. It was probably 3 or 4 years ago. They switched away from the bad loss concept and just looked at the really good stuff. But in disparity, if we're talking SOS, I mean, we were messaging before about Webster. That we're staring at one of those potential cases. So I don't know how we didn't have that disparity. Those disparity conversations when I was.
I just feel like if one of your pieces of criteria is not above some threshold, you almost don't get looked at. And so it doesn't really matter. Like Rochester's a great case last year. So many wins versus region ranked opponents, a really strong strength of schedule, but I think their winning percentage was 640 or something. And so I would bet they did not get a serious look. And in our prediction or guesses, we didn't really give them a serious look either.
Where were they regionally in week 1?
That's a good question. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if they had a low winning percentage even then,
right?
Even before they were really deep into UAA play, because I think they had just about the best strength of schedule, so they must have scheduled really strong non-conference in addition to that UAA schedule.
Yeah, I mean, if I remember right, they were a team that we were really seriously talking about in top 25 and all those things, and then they kind of started to fall off. I think they lost 4 or 5 straight games at one point through UAA play, and that really hurt them because it was obviously late, and you don't have a conference tournament to kind of try to get yourself a couple more of those regionally ranked wins, get that SOS a little bit higher. So, yeah, I think Rochester had that bad stretch in late January, early February, and those things will really hurt you when it comes to the selection time.
They were 14-1 through January 15th, but I don't know of a quick way to pull up what the week 1 regional rankings were.
Yeah. Was all the teams with your above 625 from the WIAC, UAA, NESCAC?
Well, let's see here. The top. Well, there's a couple that sneak in there, like some bad ARC teams because they play the best ones. So actually, I have Nebraska Wesleyan as my 10th strongest strength of schedule. But yeah, it's WIAC, UAA, UAA, NESCAC, all up top, and then 2 more WIACs. So next, we're going to talk about newcomers. So I crunched numbers in the offseason about the class of each team's roster and production last year and what percentage of production we were expecting to return. But then since then, there were seniors that came back for a 5th year. There were players that transferred. There were players that had not used up all their eligibility but are not on the roster this year for, doesn't really matter the reason. So that kind of gave us an advanced look at what teams might be different than we were expecting. But once you see actual production from transfers, especially non-Division III transfers and freshmen, you really get a better picture of where the teams are at. And so I am less hooked into individual players, but if there's anything that you want to comment on, Riley or Justin, please do. These are players. The metric that I've created is just points per 30 minutes, and they have to have been what I consider in the rotation. So they have to be averaging at least 7 minutes per a team's 40 minutes. So there might be a player that averages 6.9 minutes and they just fall right below this threshold. But so far, these are the players, and it might be a game or 2 old for some of these players, but who are averaging the most points on a per minute basis for roughly the top 60 teams are the teams that I looked at.
Yeah, I mean, and just to answer Justin's question really quickly, Rochester was third in the first regional ranking
Mm.
behind Ithaca and New Paltz. But yeah, Scott, you and I have talked about this over the last few weeks. I mean, there's several players on here too who I think the opportunity is there for them to step in early. This is, in some ways a balance between, the ability to be college ready, and there's a lot of players that will end up progressing a little bit slower maybe through their freshman, sophomore years, but take a big jump between that sophomore and junior year. So a lot of these players on this list, when you look at them, they have a skill set that makes them fit within their new program well, and they also are able to kind of have that IQ, maybe that basketball IQ that allows them to make that quick switch, because adjusting to the college level, it is a faster game. There's other things that come into play. But yeah, I mean, one that I've had the chance to see several times, Lexi Harris there at WashU has been a huge, huge source of their offense this season. And, she was a player that had Division I offers coming out of high school, chose to go to WashU, but has been one of the most impactful players in terms of freshmen that I've seen from the UAA schools this season. Could have a really, really good year. And there's several players on this list who have had the opportunity there. They've taken the opportunity and they've stepped up. And it's really important for these programs to have these freshmen contributing early, because in a lot of these cases, as you look down this list, these were teams that lost quite a few seniors last season. They needed their newcomers to really step into these roles right away.
I've found that pure minutes played is a great proxy for contribution to a team, because coaches are not dumb. They will play players more if they are positive contributors to the team, and they'll play them less if they're not. And so, I also do tons of baseball analysis, and there's WAR, and then there's all kinds of counting stats and all this stuff. But I found that if you just look at plate appearances and innings pitched, it's a really simple but pretty good measure of is this player good, because you just don't continue to get playing time if you're not good. And so, yeah, especially these players on Smith and Chicago and WashU, those are teams that graduated a lot of really good talent last year. And so it definitely created more of an opportunity for a freshman to contribute, but they have taken the opportunity and run with it. And then also wanted to flip to the next list. So this is more freshmen. Wartburg getting great production from 2 freshmen, and they did not graduate very much. Newport did graduate a lot, but they have just reloaded with a bunch of players who are they all seem to be 5'10" or 5'11", and they're contributing as freshmen. Hope graduated a ton. Colby is an interesting team. We're going to get to Colby, I think, but they have added a ton of new talent. But in addition to freshmen, there's also transfers, not only among Division III teams, but also from outside of Division III into Division III. Oh, first we're going to hit team sums. So these are the sum of those points per 30 minutes for freshmen that are in the rotation. And you can see WashU, Chicago, Smith, Colby, and Emory are teams that have a lot of production from those newcomer freshmen. And I think it's kind of scary to see Newport there. I think that this year's Newport team might be the worst Newport will be in the last 5 years and the next 5 years, which is not a great proposition for the rest of Division III.
Yeah, they have a lot. They have a lot coming, and that's another thing too, Scott. Like when you look at this is often an indication too, sometimes of recruiting and the approach to recruiting. I guess Newport knew they had to go out and get some players that were going to really come in and contribute, especially there in the post. They did that, and it's really benefited them so far this season. Just watching these newcomers kind of fit into that rotation, and with several of these teams, I think they've been in a spot where their freshmen have come in, but they've also had this nice balance. If you look at some of these teams, they do have a key senior or two that can kind of offset things. It allows for there to be a little bit more balance, which obviously then can give the freshmen a little bit more of an opportunity maybe to create some plays, versus we've all seen situations where they bring out freshmen or they bring out transfers, we'll get to here in a second. And that player is expected to do a lot more maybe than they need to, and can create kind of an offset of the balance. So I think the other thing to note with these teams is they are balanced. When you watch them play, they distribute the ball well, they move the ball well offensively. It does play a role, I think, in the overall contributions of each individual player out on the floor and within the rotation.
Yeah, Riley, that's really good. On this list, Scott, you see a ton that graduated a bunch and a ton that didn't. I think, between Warburg and Gustavus, Concordia Moorhead and Puget Sound returned a bunch. To see their freshman production is impressive, but you're also, like Riley mentioned, probably surrounding them with 4 returners that played a ton that take a bunch of pressure off them. So that's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. I don't know if you can comment on this, Justin, but how aware are recruits of like, oh, the team returned everybody or they graduated a ton? Like, is that a factor?
I think they know. Because of COVID, I think everybody's asking the question when you sit down and on those visits, who's coming back. And, the roster says one thing, but 5th years are a little bit harder to pick out. So when I was doing it, we got the question all the time.
Yeah. And I mean, with COVID, that's a lot more of a factor when you have grad transfers and grad returners. But there definitely are some rosters out there that added a bunch of talent to a ton of existing talent in a way that has kind of squeezed out playing time for really good returners. And it can be tough when, you were recruited, you played a lot and you play less because a lot of new talent almost came in sideways, not to put a negative spin on it, but maybe unexpected to you. So these are the team sums for freshmen. And then for transfers, I think we did know about Morrison and expected that to be one of the most impactful transfers. I think it has been. I know I heard a lot about Ava Bardich, and I don't know if it's Bardich or Bardick, but she's been terrific. Katie Hildebrandt and Victoria Toomey and Kaylee Romanowski were also names that I knew. Well, they were on my radar. I don't follow transfers super closely, but they're on my radar as likely being key. But I think Trinity has gained a lot of new production that's been key for them.
Yeah, I think, the transfers, and this is obviously in some of these on this list, Scott, we do see these grad transfers coming in, whether they be Division 3 to Division 3 or, they're coming from Division 1 or Division 2. I think as Dave McHugh mentioned, and when he had the trio from NYU on his show last week or the week before, I think it was 2 weeks ago, there's always this conversation of like, in some cases, they may not have the opportunity to go to grad school at their former school, and so they do end up transferring. It's created some of these situations now where teams are, like NYU, bringing in this talent that's immediately ready to contribute in the starting lineup, and we've seen that. But you also see, Ava Bardick at Illinois Wesleyan coming in. She's a sophomore, but she's made a huge impact to that program in the backcourt. And so as you go down the list, I think you see a nice mix of players who are transferring in, and whether they're coming from the Division 1 or 2 levels, they're coming as sophomores or juniors, and they're immediately ready. You also see quite a few grad transfers on this list who have done the same thing. And, the impact of transfers, especially now, I think is greater than maybe it's ever been. And we're seeing that, at the Division 1 level, of course, but also at the Division 3 level in a big way, with players coming in and contributing right away, which immediately has made some of these teams more competitive and contenders within their conferences, and in some cases, contenders on a more national stage.
I think one thing that isn't as noticeable, but it correlates directly. Scott, you produced whose scoring ratios are way up, and I think near the top of that list was Aaliyah Grundahl, Whitewater. Well, when you bring in a Division 1 post player in Katie Hildebrandt, who's is the second best defender now guarding a D3 All-American, and is that why her numbers are insanely higher as a 5th year? Because you don't see that kind of jump a lot, but I wonder if that's the case, and definitely an impact outside of just scoring.
Yeah, for sure. And looking at this list, Dartmouth, Illinois Wesleyan, Catholic, I think are all better than a lot better than we were expecting. And it's probably largely due to transfers that are contributing a ton. And then my last list of newcomers was newcomers that did not fall into the transfer or freshman list. So this, I may have the reason wrong, but I have year off, injury, or low minutes. So if they played basically like 15 minutes or less total last year, which might have been injury related, I don't really know. But these are other players that, for all intents and purposes, are new to this year's roster, even if they had been on at the school and on this team in years past. And again, like Cole Morgan at Mary Hardin Baylor has been just a huge addition for them. Wheaton getting Tate back, MIT having, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Antona Kakis. That's been huge for them. They've been way better than we were expecting, and she's a big reason why. Another player for Catholic. So I don't know. It's kind of been really nice for me to learn about, or interesting to learn about all the ways that you just can't predict what's going to happen in the next year, because of all of these potential reasons that the roster can change in really dramatic ways.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And we've seen it, Scott, when you're looking at these teams, evaluating them, we often go to the transfers and we go to the freshmen, but you kind of forget in some of these cases where players may have been out with injury for the entirety of that year. They were, they took a year off for one reason or another. They immediately come back. And in some cases, these players are having bigger impacts on their team than any transfer or any freshman did. Because, in a lot of these cases, they were experienced. They in some of these, they were key contributors before they took that year off or had that injury or whatever it was. And now that they're back, their impact is just as good as it was, or if not more, in the case of a player like Cole Morgan at Mary Hardin Baylor. So, I think we're seeing that throughout the division. Is this is another thing that I think when I was evaluating teams early on in the preseason, you kind of forget about, you don't know about some of these things, but when they come up on the roster, when you see them play out, they're making a huge impact and definitely going to be players that will be in their conversations for all conference and those kinds of things, which, obviously can, hugely impact a team's potential, both record wise and NCAA tournament wise, as we go into all those different things later on in the year.
And you look on this list, there's two players from Amherst who already returned 100% of their production from last year. And these were players that didn't play last year as freshmen due to injury and are already key contributors. And those are, huge additions that aren't going to get labeled into their current year recruiting class or anything like that, but very key. Brings us to our random stats part of the show. Which is kind of the whole show. But first off, I started looking at rotations, and rotations as I have labeled them. I am not a coach of any of these teams. I'm sure they would label them much differently. But how many players average at least 7 minutes out of the team's 40 minutes? And kind of a reason I started looking at this is if you have a small rotation, you probably are less resilient to injuries or off nights or an incredible defense that plays you. And if you have large rotations, maybe you are more resilient to those sorts of things. Do you have any thoughts, either of you, on ways that like the size of the contributing group of players can be a factor on a team or not? Or is it more just kind of often stylistic, because you see here Christopher Newport, and Hope, like teams that often are speeding you up and playing with a more aggressive defensive strategy that really almost requires having a larger rotation.
Yeah, I'd like to hear Justin's thoughts on this. I guess from my perspective, I think, it seems like in some ways, we've seen Amherst, really do well with a really, really small rotation year after year. But as you said, Scott, like, say an injury happens at some point, that can be a big factor. If now you have to, put a player into that rotation that really hasn't gotten a lot of playing time, doesn't have a lot of experience. So I do think there is something to be said for having a larger rotation. I think there's got to be a fine line though, because, in a lot of ways, the chemistry on the court is so, predicated on how big or small that rotation is. And sometimes you have better chemistry out of a team when you do play a smaller rotation. You got, 4 or 5 players who are all playing 25 to 30 minutes a game. It depends on, of course, your region and your style of play, probably within your conference too, and how much depth you're going to need, how fast, the style of the game is. If you're playing a team like Illinois Wesleyan or someone like that, you're going to need to be able to keep pace with them, which means having that depth will probably play into that. But I think there's a fine line. I've seen teams have too large of a rotation, and it messes up with the chemistry on the court. But also having too small of a rotation can be a problem as well at times with things like injuries and other factors based on the opponent.
I have a couple of thoughts. I'd like to see this list in 2 months when the disparity of scores maybe evens out some.
Yeah.
Because you can really pick up, with a lopsided victory, add a couple to the rotation list, so to speak. But that being said, Oshkosh is a super balanced team. Hope is a super balanced team. Wartburg's a super balanced team. Chicago, like all of those teams and more. I think Puget Sound's that same way. Legit can have a different score every single night, and nobody's really surprised. DePaul has probably a 4-headed monster in their top scoring list. So, not saying without a true star, because these are really, really good programs, but super balanced list for sure.
Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, these were the smallest rotations that I found, which the size of the rotation, I mean, it says in, right? So like we know Transylvania, only 7 players getting kind of regular minutes, but they're all really, really, really good. So it's not commenting on the quality at all. But I think Elizabethtown they must have 9. But they, dropped a game recently against Catholic and were missing, I think, 2 of their rotation players. And I would imagine that is tougher to sustain if you have that a relatively smaller rotation than other teams do.
We saw Bardic go down 2 games ago with Illinois Wesleyan. And they looked awesome against Carroll last night, and didn't look like they missed a beat, really. And she's an outstanding player and a huge, huge piece to them, I'm sure. But they look pretty smooth adding another to the rotation last night. Not to defunct your list, but.
No, I just, because I have the data, it's interesting to see, like, is there anything interesting in it? But a huge part is opportunity. Like for Illinois Wesleyan, Sawyer White had, a crazy stat line with 8 assists, 8 steals. And most good teams probably have a player that would put up some really good numbers if they played double the minutes.
Right.
So that's rotations. I also looked at concentration. So what % of a team's total scoring do the top 5 scorers constitute? I don't know if this means that it's easier to take a hit on a team scoring because if you really try to defend a key player or something like that. Obviously that doesn't work very well against Transylvania. But this is another thing, Dickinson stands way far out. Like all their scoring basically comes from 5 players. Again, I don't know if that's bad or if that's good, because that means that those players are really good and hard to defend.
Yeah, it's interesting, Scott, because I think, and teams win different ways, right? And, everyone has their own style. Yeah, it's interesting too when you look. I think once teams get into conference play, especially some of these down the list, like you're gonna start to see a little more balance maybe as things play out. But a lot of these teams on this list too, they have small rotations, and so a lot of that is coming from those starting 5 who are playing quite a few minutes. I mean, there are several teams on this list, just taking a glance, who have a couple of players who are averaging, high 20s, low 30s in terms of minutes. That'll definitely play a role, because if those players are out there for the majority of the game and these teams are playing well, they're putting up a lot of points. In a case like Transylvania, where we've seen them score quite a few and win with some lopsided scores, like they're going to have the majority of the points because they're out there for so long. But yeah, it's interesting and interesting at this point in the year early on to kind of see how these numbers look, and be interesting to bring some of these back around when we talk in January or February and see if they changed and how they've changed, because it might be an interesting progression of a season in terms of the stats for these teams, and how often and how much they're having to rely on their starting five, or if other players by that point have kind of stepped up and stepped into some more contributing roles off the bench.
And I'm always looking for anecdotes, but I don't know if I'm just looking for anecdotes that confirm the theory that I have, because Rhode Island College struggled against, both Bridgewater and Babson. And in one of those games, they didn't have Nardolillo. And so if you get a ton of your scoring from your top 5 players and you don't have one of them, it could be harder to overcome. I don't know where Illinois Wesleyan falls in this list, but they relatively did not struggle against Carroll, missing arguably their 2 best players. So then the flip side of concentration, like, my goodness, Christopher Newport and Scranton are large rotation, balanced scoring, but also have great players. There's a reason why they're, top 5 teams.
Right. Now you see a lot of these top teams on this list, because I think too, and sometimes in non-conference, like, Newport has won several games by pretty large margins where the Stars have only played, a few minutes in that game, and so it does allow for some opportunities for the bench to contribute a little bit more. I mean, and two, again, this speaks to the depth on these teams, right? It's not uncommon to look some of these teams here at the bottom of this list and you see their leading scorer was someone who came off the bench. It's just the way that things work out for them with the depth that they have. They have a lot of quality players who, for one reason or another may not be starting, but can come off the bench and get you 10 or 12 points right away. And that's a big deal to have, especially with the conferences that some of these teams are playing in, Emory and NYU, especially if they're in the UAA. You want to be able to have that depth as the season goes along.
Next random stat is percentage of your production that comes from non-seniors and non-graduates. This is obviously really forward-looking because this doesn't necessarily help you this year. But I would imagine a lot of these teams are pretty solidly in the mix as we move forward, as they are relatively young as far as where they're getting their production. Kind of a lot in Region 7, right?
Yeah.
With Trine, Carnegie Mellon, Hope, DePauw, and then in Region 8, Illinois Wesleyan, and just Illinois Wesleyan. But yeah, so I think Region 7 is which kind of makes sense, because I think Region 7 might have taken a step backwards this year. Well, in some ways, but other conferences are taking a step forward in the region. But
right.
And then my last one I tweeted about the other day, which is this is super small. Sorry about that, but it's the minutes weighted height for teams. So the more minutes you play, the greater effect your height has on your team's collective stat. And I don't know what to take from this. Like, the difference between the top team that I tracked, Williams, and the bottom, Stevens, is 3.6 inches, which doesn't feel like a very large difference to me. And if you move past the couple outliers, like 70.1 to 67.8, that's an even smaller difference from, I don't know, like, how big of a difference is this, Justin? Like is 2 inches across the board for all the players on the floor like a big deal? Or does it really manifest itself differently?
I think it is. If you're talking 5'10" point guard against 5'8" point guard, I think it is. I'm piggybacking off this. I don't want to do a Final Four metric over the last decade or so, just to get a feel for that. And but I do feel like that 2 inches is a big deal.
Because I was looking down this list, and I mean, there are good teams, like top teams, all kind of throughout. You know, Transylvania's right down there, kind of average. So is Gustavus. Who's the best team that would be below average? I mean, Scranton's below average, barely. Rhode Island College went to the Final Four last year, and they're pretty far below average. So it's not any hard and fast rule, but it would be interesting to see that historical, Justin, if you're like, oh, like pretty much every Final Four team is above average. Because I think it is also different. Like, can you go 21-4 in the regular season, and can you reach the Elite Eight or the Final Four? It could be the makeups of those teams are actually different. I think one example is like last year, both Hope and Christopher Newport had tremendous point differentials and turnover differentials all throughout the year. And I think that's largely because they can turn over opposing teams very effectively. But I was assuming that they would both struggle the further they got in the NCAA tournament, because there are incredible ball handlers that they would face. They would be able to kind of neutralize that one huge team skill. I can't remember if Hope was not able to turn Wartburg over a lot, but you definitely see the turnover rates plummet in the tournament the farther that you go. And so, you know, that's kind of one way that a team's profile that allows them to succeed early in the year might be less of a factor as they face stronger and stronger competition. And I don't know if height maybe at the beginning of the year is not the largest factor, but late in the tournament it becomes a larger factor. Don't know. I'll be interested to see what kind of numbers you pull out historically, Justin.
Well, Christopher is skewing my numbers right now.
Interesting. I mean, I think Christopher Newport might be an outlier in lots of statistical areas.
Yeah.
Exception, not the rule. So then last one is regional rankings. So these are using my projections through to the end of the regular season. So this is not a prediction of what week one of the regional rankings will look like or anything like that. But we kind of have an idea about where a team's strength of schedule will be, where like how many games versus regional ranked opponents they will have. And these projections take into account if they already have beaten a team that I expect to be a regionally ranked opponent. And so I'll shoot out any thoughts that I have, and you guys can follow along with any thoughts that you have. So in region one, I think there's kind of a clear 4, maybe 5 in some order. But then beyond that, Framingham State and Albertus Magnus, I think kind of have thrown a wrench into things, because I have their strength of schedules being really low. And historically they've been close in past years. They've been closer to an 800 or 900 winning percentage team, which was enough to overcome a 500, 510 SOS. But I think they have a lower winning percentage and a worse SOS than last year. And at the moment I have them both like outside of the top 7. I could be projecting my SOS low for some teams that have a really low strength of schedule, because I adjust everybody's expected winning percentage based on how they're doing this year. And so if a lot of the bottom teams in your conference have lost a lot, I might be reducing those teams' winning percentages below what is reasonable, because later in the year, those teams in the same conference have to play each other and somebody has to win those games. And so it could be that Framingham State doesn't end up with a 477. They end up with a 495 or maybe even a 505. I think it's less likely that a team with a high strength of schedule has one that changes a ton. But for a team like St. Joseph of Connecticut, they could easily end up with a 480 strength of schedule. And then the NESCAC teams, I think, are going to beat each other up. Like Millbury has taken quite a few losses already this year. I was expecting them to be a lot more in the mix, and right now I have them below a 600 winning percentage. Winning percentage is the biggest thing that teams can change, though, because you win one more game than I am quote unquote expecting, and it adds 40 points to your winning percentage. roughly one divided by 25.
Hmm.
Whereas your strength of schedule is due to all your opponents and all of their opponents. And so even if one of them is way better than I'm expecting, it doesn't have the same ability to change the strength of schedule. But any thoughts on Region 1?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. The NESCAC is just up there, and it's interesting too because with the NESCAC schedule, and Scott, you and I talked about this last year on one of these shows. That they run through that schedule one time, so you don't necessarily have what you have in a lot of conferences where they're going to play twice, and there's that chance to split. The regular season series between two teams. They're playing each other once. I think that does help in a big way with the way a team's resumes turn out looking, because they're going out and they're playing a lot more non-conference games. I would say because of their ability and their access to schedule some of these better teams in the new MAC and some of these other conferences, it gives them the chance to build up that strength of schedule and at the same time going through conference. Their win percentage may not take as much of a hit as you might expect because they aren't having to play some of these teams twice. Like, Williams isn't having to play Tufts and Trinity of Connecticut twice. So it can influence things a little bit more, maybe, at least from what I'm looking at, than some of these other conferences, which allows for the NESCAC to now have, where you have them, the top 8 spots here, which is pretty crazy. We're not going to see that with any of the other regions.
No, I think more conferences should probably do this, break the formula. But this is the region I know the least about, other than its NESCAC world.
Go ahead, Scott.
It is just such a force multiplier to your potential resume.
Yep.
The more teams in your conference that get ranked. And so I still have a decently high percentage of being ranked for Framingham State and Albertus Magnus, because I feel like somehow they make their way into the rankings. And those, will remove 1 or 2 games versus region ranked opponents from every single NESCAC from these current projections.
Yeah. I was just going to add, I've talked to coaches about this conference setup, and really the thing is, although people understand it would improve their resume, I think so many schools have trouble scheduling non-conference, and I don't know what it is in the Northeast. These schools tend to seem to get quality matchups year in, year out. A lot of other coaches I talk to across the country have trouble, especially when they're a good team, getting other good teams to play them, to come to them. These schools don't seem to have that problem. So, they're able to do this setup, which benefits them in a big way. A lot of other conferences and schools, this wouldn't work. So I think, and I don't know if it's location or there's a lot of factors that play into it, right?
Geographical proximity has to be just a huge deal.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Like, I don't think any Region 10 conference could ever feasibly do this, right? But potentially a Midwest, if you're an Illinois conference, maybe. And I'm sure some New York ones could. Region 2, not terribly dissimilar. I mean, actually, no, it is pretty different. There's, I think, 4, maybe 5 that are fairly strong. Babson has taken a couple losses. I think they're less strong than they've been in years past. Dartmouth, with a really nice step up, is inside the line right now. And then I think it was just last night, Western New England beat University of New England or sometime recently. And so I'm not factoring in any head-to-head or common opponents in this calculation at the moment. But Roger Williams is kind of down from what we've seen in past years. So I think there's still a lot of opportunity here for teams to move around, because you see I've got 2 teams that I project to have under a 500 SOS in the regional rankings. And so if a team like Coast Guard can get above 600 winning percentage, or I don't think WPI really can, but if they do, I think they could easily jump into the 6th or the 7th spot in the region.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like a region where there's a lot of things that could change. A lot, maybe more than Region 1, at least from where we're seeing things right now, just because there's a lot of teams in that mix, especially there, as you mentioned, Scott, towards the bottom, 5, 6, and 7. I could see that changing a lot, over the next couple of months, just because, we're going to see some of these results start to happen and be factored in. And, I think Babson, they've shown flashes of being really, really good, but they just haven't been able to sustain that success. And the more losses you take, it'll affect you. With that said, though, I don't see Babson falling completely out. I think it would take a lot for them to fall out, especially with the new MAC schedule and all the things that are going to happen for them, and they still got a lot, several non-conference games to go. But it is interesting to see the bottom of this region, how things might factor in, because again, while the 7th team in this region may not contend for a Pool C spot, it's going to affect the teams towards the top of the region that did play them, in the case that they played them, to give them, an additional regionally ranked win. And that's a big deal when you get into that Pool C discussion and, taking teams off the board and all that stuff.
I'm not sure it's enough to jump RIC, but Smith, with what they lost, put something out today. They have the top offense in the country right now in points per possession, and that's Lynn Hersey's really good at what she does.
Yeah, so I think Smith looks to have a really good recruiting class, and we'll see how they come along, because Virginia Johnson is very high up my rate stat, but hasn't played a ton of minutes, like about 45 or 50 minutes on the year. Yeah. But that's the type of player that if they get her comfortable in playing a lot more minutes, it can really change a season. Region 3 kind of feels similar to Region 2, a couple strong teams up top, and then a lot of potential for movement down at the bottom. I was going to say through Vassar, but really the top 4 feel really solid. And then after that, I'm not sure, because Vassar doesn't have a very strong strength of schedule. So if they take a couple losses and get below 700 winning percentage, they could be not ranked. I've got St. John Fisher projected for a really low strength of schedule and very few RRO opportunities, which I think could hold them back. But I would imagine above an 800 winning percentage still gets them ranked. But the 7th spot right now is pretty weak. And so any of those teams below really do have a chance to get into the rankings. And if it's the second team, if it's not a Skyline, if it's like Houghton, so the second from the Empire 8 or the second SUNYAC, it really helps that top team in the conference.
Right. Yeah, I think, this is another conference, or another region, I should say, where, we're going to see some movement, I think. Once you get into these conference schedules, some things can factor in there. But I do think, the top of this region feels very strong. I just think, those schools, especially top 4, as you mentioned, Scott, should feel pretty confident about where they're at. But at the same time, like, it's gonna be interesting with some of these conference dynamics. Even the Skyline, right? Like, the Skyline is from what I'm looking at, somewhat of a wide open conference this year, and so getting that last spot in there could be a big deal for some of these teams, because there are some common opponents. I'd have to go back and look at the schedules to see who all shares potential common opponents, but some of these teams here, 8, 9, 10, if they play one of those teams, top 4, top 5, it could really play a role in things. So yeah, it'll be an interesting region to follow,
because there's not much difference between these resumes as I'm projecting them, and so head to head and common opponents can hold a lot of weight if everything else is so close.
Rochester's an interesting one on top there. They're 3-3 right now. Then 2 of their next 4 are Mary Wash and Ithaca, and then they start UAA play. So that'll be a fun one to watch.
It will be. Let's just see here. Rochester, if I just flip them to 600 winning percentage flat, that moves them to 6th in the region, from the current 715. So yeah, that's one thing I keep coming back to, is like my winning percentage projections are not based on much.
Yep.
And 1 or 2 extra wins or losses, especially in close games, which can kind of go either way, really changes what a team's winning percentage can look like. Region 4, I think those top 3 are pretty locked in, as they've got above average criteria across the board. And then below that, we could see anything below that, really. The NJAC looks to be a lot worse this year. I kind of think it's unlikely for a second NJAC team to be regionally ranked. And it's kind of interesting to see a couple extra MAC Freedom teams doing better than they have in the past. I was surprised to see both Arcadia and Delaware Valley in there with not super aggressive winning percentage projections. So like, I don't think it's unlikely, that they get there and are regionally ranked, because there's not a strong SOS team that's going to really take it from them. Misericordia, Lebanon Valley, and Kings, Pennsylvania are the only ones above 500 once you hit the 4th spot here.
Yeah, I think that's interesting league, Sky, because it feels like obviously DeSales, Stevens feel like the 1 and 2 pretty comfortably, but after that there's going to be some teams that are really contending for that number 3 spot, and in this situation, like we could see like a team like DeSales or Stevens pick up some more RO wins than they've had in the past, which could be a big deal even when you get to bracketing, things like that. But I think that conference this year, just looking at conferences as a whole, it's really been nice to see them competing so well in non-conference play. And we'll have to see how things play out, but definitely some teams on the rise there, which makes this region a little bit more interesting, at this point in time. But, probably one of the weaker regions, and that's of no fault to any of these teams, but just in terms of when you're matching up against the rest of the regions, these are teams that kind of, it feels like there's a lot that could happen there, even between 4, 5, 6, 7, and all the way down. There's a lot of movement or potential for movement, I should say, as we get more into conference schedules.
Looking at the 20 teams that I've projected to have the most games versus regional ranked opponents, they're all UAA, NESCAC, or WIAC, except for 2 MAC Freedom teams, Stevens and Misericordia, which I found interesting because it means that the MAC Freedom is better as a conference, or at least more teams regionally ranked. But it also means that those schools scheduled hard in non-conference. It picked up some there, and the reason you're not going to see DeSales is because I have them as guaranteed to be regionally ranked, and they can't face themselves. And all the other teams I have is less than 100% chance to be ranked. And so DeSales, they can't face themselves. And so it's harder for them to get to the same sum that Stevens or Misericordia can get to. That's region 4. Region 5. This is another region that's really fun. It's dominated by those 2 conferences, Landmark and the Centennial. The Centennial has been really solid in non-conference this year. And I think that there's a lot of option for movement here too. I think Catholic's been maybe the most surprising team. They added a couple newcomers, and as of right now, like, I had Marymount was one of my darlings in preseason. They brought back almost everybody. I thought that they would roll up a winning percentage close to 900, and they've taken more losses than I was expecting. And with a weak SOS and not many RRO opportunities, they could struggle to get ranked in this region. Because like comparing them to Dickinson, I could see Dickinson being ranked above them. But we'll have to see once teams start playing each other some, and because Marymount might not lose in conference, right? And Dickinson could take 6 losses or 3 losses or what have you. So
yeah, I think the Landmark's gonna be really interesting, Scott. Catholic looked really good the other night. Obviously, didn't get a chance to watch that game, but Catholic, it seems like a team that they lost some talent, but they've reloaded, and they have some players who are contributing in big ways that maybe we weren't necessarily expecting coming into the year. I think, having one more team that's in this mix just makes the conference so much more competitive, and really increases its profile in terms of regional rankings. So that's nice to see for those Landmark teams. And Centennial is going to be another good one this year. Really, several teams there who are in competition for that top spot. It'll be an interesting region because of that and those dynamics within those conferences, and several contenders there at the top of those leagues.
I think outside of a Pool A in the MAC Commonwealth, Messiah will wrap up their regionally ranked games by Christmas. And that'll be, they have a big stretch here. That'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, because let's see here. I have Messiah as currently 1 and 2 wins RRO and 0.7 losses RRO, depending on if teams actually end up ranked or not. And so that means that they've faced about 2 out of their possible 5, and it could be less than 5 when it's all said and done.
Well, they got DeSales, Mary Wash, and Whitewater.
Yep.
So it might be 5.
Yep. Region 6, we've got a lot of maybe locks up top. I mean, I kind of would have a hard time. Well, I don't know about Berea. They're going to have a really high winning percentage. That SOS might take up and end up being 470, 480 before it's all said and done. But I really don't know how a committee would view them compared to, say, I mean, no one else's SOS is that good either. So I think that's why Berea ends up so high, because I'm just applying the implicit weights that I got from all of the rankings last year. And it's not like, oh, they're going to look at Rhodes at 520 and jump them up there. I don't think. I do know in Region 10 last year, the couple teams that had really low SOSs, one was Laverne. Even though they had a winning percentage above 800, it feels like they got set to the side. And a team like, I think it was ETBU, was ranked pretty highly over Laverne. And so that was an indication that having a low SOS, especially if it stands out in your region, will get you kind of set to the side. But I don't think Berea's low SOS does stand out in the region.
Right.
They're kind of the best option in that 5, 6, 7 range compared to all of the other teams that have an SOS similar or worse than they do.
Yeah, I think that'll be an interesting dynamic to follow because, and Scott, if we think back to the spring, I think late February when we were breaking this down right before Selection Monday, this was one of those regions that was kind of interesting to look at in terms of numbers. I think we're seeing a similar thing again this year where, we have some really solid locks at the top, Emory, Christopher Newport, WNL, Mary Wash. But you do have some of those teams there, and ODAC and, Berea as well, who their numbers may not jump off the page, but they're within the region. They're your top teams there because, whatever it might be, scheduling or whatever, their numbers are better than the rest. But at the same time, kind of 5, 6, and 7 again in this region feels like it could be. We could see some movement there. I don't know though that we'll see as much movement as we'll see in some of these other regions, just because these teams feel a lot more like locks even early on in the season than we see with Region 4, Region 3.
And you can see the bulk of these teams have very few RRO opportunities, and so really they didn't schedule almost anything in non-conference because. Guilford having about 2 or 3. Well, they're going to get those in conference. That's Washington, Lee, and Macon, right? That's what's reflected there. Similar for Shenandoah and Randolph College. Looks like Bridgewater might have scheduled a couple non-conference. I think. Did they just play Newport? I think that they just played somebody of note.
Yeah.
But yeah. With no one really standout SOS or many options versus region ranked opponents, it's harder for them to move a lot. I mean, I could totally see a team like Shenandoah picking up a couple wins we didn't expect, and boom, they're at a 770 winning percentage. Wouldn't shock me at all.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Bridgewater went out and they got CNU, they got WNL. That's about the extent of what they're going to get though in terms of non-conference and. Getting Christopher Newport, I should say. That's about the extent of your quality results there. It is an interesting scheduling dynamic there in Region 6.
I've never watched Center play, and they play Webster over Christmas. So I'm going to watch that one. So I'm excited to see Center play.
Is that a Puerto Rico game?
It might be.
Now I'm interested and want to pull up Bridgewater's. What I have is their possibilities.
Center's one of those teams. They're undefeated, and I put this in the newsletter not too long ago. I mean, This is one of the best starts they've ever had in program history. Like they could be a team that may end up being able to flip. But again, this is where it depends on win percentage and those kinds of things. So I think their win percentage will be high. Strength of schedule probably won't be very notable though.
They got Webster at Webster, and then they play Washington and Lee in a tournament prior to that. So kind of a big month for them.
Yeah, it looks like Bridgewater, Virginia played Catholic also, non-conference. So Christopher Newport and Catholic were their big non-conferences. The ODAC is big, right? And that's why they only play Washington and Lee once. Like it's not a double round robin for everybody. All right. Getting to the regions I know best. Region 7 here. This region is, I have almost no idea what to think of it because as I expected, I think Trine, Hope, the 4 MIAA teams are less good than they were last year. Not saying they're not good. They're just less good than they were last year. But surprising to me, I feel like Baldwin Wallace and Ohio Northern are less good than I was expecting. And so even though Wittenberg, Ohio Wesleyan, probably Oberlin, and Chatham are having nice seasons, I'm really not sure where this region's going to go. I mean, Washington and Jefferson already has a loss and it's going to have a bad SOS. But Carnegie Mellon I think they lost to Denison, which is not a very good loss. And so I don't know who ends up in the 7th spot. And I'm not very sure that any of my top 6 are even locks, I think just based on SOS and RRO opportunities, a lot of those top 6, I think they would have to lose kind of a lot to fall out. Maybe not Marietta. But Hope and Trine probably need to be pretty close to 700, and same with Baldwin Wallace and Ohio Northern. Well, they probably have to be closer to 650 to not be in the top 7 in this region. And I think all of that is pretty unlikely, but I really don't know. Like, does W&J get in there as they kind of always have? I feel like it's been a mixed bag of results from almost everyone in this region.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really has been. It's been really tough from a voter's perspective to figure out, who to put ahead of who and how things, work out. Because I think, we expected Baldwin Wallace and especially Ohio Northern to be really, really solid, and they just have not been at that level early on in this season. But, it doesn't even – I don't think anyone here, as you said, Scott, is a lock. I think there's certain teams that probably can feel pretty confident about being ranked. But, again, in terms of the order, it doesn't feel like there's any kind of clarity in terms of where that order is going to shake out. I mean, seems like we may get confident on one team 1 week, and then they go the next week and they go 1-1, or they barely win a game that they should win by a lot more. Like, we just never know it so far, and it's been an interesting region to follow, but it's been very tough when it comes to figuring out where teams should be ranked, and I think it'll come down to, obviously, as usual, a lot of head-to-heads within this region as well in terms of the order of things.
We got some giants yet coming up. ONU and Marietta battle next week maybe, and then they go to Trinity, I think. So that'll be good data. I think DePauw is a sneaky one because they can be really, really good, but they've also dropped a few head scratchers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because DePauw kind of cleaned Calvin out.
Got Oshkosh good too.
Well, actually, DePauw has only lost to Transylvania, Millikin, and Wash U.
Yeah.
And I think Wash U is better than I feel like the average person thinks, but yeah, DePauw could be interesting. What's their 558 SOS with some RRO opportunities, and so like they definitely have the ability. Like if they get the winning percentage over 700, or close to it, even they could definitely be ranked. I think DePauw's a nice pick. Region 8, we've got, what have we got here? So Chicago and WashU both graduated a ton, and I think are worse than they were last year, but still good teams. I'm guessing that WashU still hangs on there, but they could be similar to Rochester. Take a couple losses and that winning percentage gets under 600. It might be tough for them to be ranked, but they have so much wiggle room because of the SOS and all of the RROs. But Chicago's looked great. Millikins look great. Most of the CCIW are better than we were expecting. Transylvania is only that low because of their SOS and few RRO opportunities. So these regional rankings are as I am assuming the committee will rank them, not what we're going to do in the top 25 poll. And I think that those top 6 kind of are locks, even though Wheaton put up a clunker the other night that was really surprising. But Wisconsin Lutheran being a little bit down from past years, even though they beat Hope, they took a surprising loss the other night. I think Aurora has looked really strong, or surprisingly strong, but they have that low SOS. It's going to really hold them back. Webster's kind of similar. I mean, Webster's probably the best bet to get into the regional rankings. So I do think they end up with an SOS around 480, 490-ish, which if their winning percentage is close to 1,000, should be enough. Maybe. I'm not really sure.
I want to see it.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think Webster has a shot here, right? Because and again, this is where the weights on win percentage, on strength of schedule come into play. Same thing with Transylvania. I mean, it's going to be interesting, but I think if Webster keeps that win percentage really high, there's an opportunity there because you never know what's going to happen in the CCIW, and CCIW feels like it has so much parity this year that we could easily see Augustana or Carroll fall behind Webster pretty quickly if you see a couple of results that end up going the opposite way for Augustana or Carroll, and give Webster the opportunity to kind of move up into that 7th spot or even maybe that 6th spot depending on the way things shake out. But there does feel like several locks in this region too, especially there at the top.
Yeah, I don't see much movement other than order. I think that 7th spot is up for grab, and I have it between Carroll and Webster, but that's just in my head. There's no statistical data between that.
Yeah, Hanover has really been a saving grace for Transylvania last couple of years. They snuck into the regional rankings, which gave Transylvania 3 regional ranked wins. And I just don't see it this year because they don't have the SOS or the RRO. The region is stronger, and Hanover already has a handful of losses this year. So I think it's going to be pretty tough for them to sneak in. But there is a possibility there.
Yep.
Region 9, another region I really don't know where it's going to go. I think those top 2 have looked really strong through and through. Some of Wartburg's RRO opportunities might be a little tenuous and could fall off. But I mean, Whitewater's looked great. They're going to be in the running. I mean, if they get that far, I don't know if they could host a sectional based on geography, but I think the resume would absolutely support it the way that they're going. But then starting in spot 3, there's not a whole lot that separates these resumes. Whether or not a team from the WIAC has a winning percentage above 700 or below it, I think is going to be a big deal. Mm-hmm. Gustavus's SOS actually looks a lot better. I think they could. This is one of the cases, though, of if they had a 558 last year, I think they would have been seeded a lot stronger in the NCAA tournament. But this year, a 558 might look similarly pedestrian to what their SOS looked last year. I think theirs was in the 520s or 530s last year. But at the moment, I have Loris out largely because of very few regionally ranked opportunities. Teams struggled to get in a strong region. Teams struggled to get ranked if they had fewer than 2 wins. Which at this point, I mean, Loris is going to need to beat Wartburg to get to above 2. And similar story with Moorhead. If you're the second best team in a conference and you did not schedule a lot in non-conference, you're going to have to beat the best team in your conference once or twice to have any NCAA tournament hopes. I don't know that anyone beyond 10th has any kind of a shot. But I think the order in the top 10, especially 3 through 10, could be almost anything. Maybe I'm pretty confident in Gustavus. I think even with an 850 winning percentage, they're probably going to be ranked. It could get weird. Well, I mean, all the WIACs can't stick around. See, that's the only sticking point is if a bunch of teams that had a lot more wins VRRO could get them above Gustavus. But I just don't think that happens with more than max really 4 WIACs, and 3 WIACs is probably the most likely number to be ranked above Gustavus.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's, in the WIAC, we've seen this last few years. Like, there's been so many results that just end up kind of, changing things when it comes to within that conference. There's such a deep conference year in, year out that, I mean, I think that order could go a lot of different ways. And again, this is the recurring conversation on the MIAC, but, Moorhead went out and they scheduled Whitewater. Like, they don't have a lot of opportunities to schedule non-conference games. So credit to them for getting that one. But, without a lot of opportunities, it's going to be really hard for you to be regionally ranked compared to a WIAC team that goes out and they, schedule several different teams that are going to be ranked within their respective regions across the country. That's a big difference here. I mean, I think part of the reason why Gustavus is down there in that 7th spot, it's just the numbers. It's their ability to get those non-conference games because most of their schedule is played within a conference, and it doesn't help them at that point.
And like, take Moorhead. They've lost to Whitewater and they've lost to Stevens Point, which I do have them in right now, but I think that's tenuous. And all that I have for Moorhead down the road is 2 games against Gustavus and then maybe a third. So if they don't beat Gustavus, they have no wins versus a region ranked opponent. And that is real tough to get ranked. And I think Loris is kind of similar, which makes their Elizabethtown game just huge. That's why I tweeted about it the other day. Like, they need that game. I think Elizabethtown needs it less, with Catholic looking likely to be ranked. Helps out E-Town a lot, but you're not going to have a third team from the ARC with any chance to be regionally ranked here, even though it's a strong conference.
I'm sneaky picking Platteville to be that 4th WIAC team, maybe 3rd, but Stout and Whitewater are the cream of the crop, I think, in that league this year.
And like, I mean, right now, those winning percentage projections are 7-10, 7-1, 7-1, 6-31. That's a difference of 2 games.
Yep.
It's like not a big difference. And one of them could end up 550 at the end of the year, and one could be 750. Like, easy. And then Region 10, another region that has some locks, but then has a lot of muddle at the end. So I don't really know how the order is going to go at the top. I think the Texas teams surprisingly have few RRO opportunities. And so that's why Whitman is sticking in this top spot, even with a lower winning percentage projection than Trinity and Hardin Simmons. But those 3 could really end up in any order. I'm still pretty bullish on Puget Sound, and their peripheral numbers are good. I think even with a winning percentage around 700, they should be good. Similar with Mary Hardin Baylor. But then beyond that, I'm not sure. Like, I was very high in Pacific to start the year. They returned almost everyone, and they were a good team last year, but they've already taken, I think, 3 losses. And so they're going to need to pick it up a little bit. But Colorado College has not looked very good. Texas Dallas is down a little bit. Santa Cruz is down. I don't even have ETBU on this list at the moment. I'll have to check. It should be updated with their pretty much guaranteed RRO win over Hardin Simmons. But I still have them probably close to a 500 winning percentage. I do not have a good feel for where this goes. I thought the Northwest Conference could be a 3-bid league. At the moment, it's looking like a 2-bid league.
Yeah, I think, this is interesting too, Scott. Like, you look at some of these leagues, Northwest Conference is a good example. I think there's a lot of depth there. I think they're going to be a good league. I don't think they're going to have the numbers, though, to be able to compete for some of these regionally ranked spots. Even Pacific, I think, could easily flip at some point. But again, the SCAC doesn't give you a lot of opportunities to get those regionally ranked results, which is why I think Colorado College, will struggle to get in there. I think Texas Lutheran is a very good team. We saw them push Trinity into overtime yesterday, but I don't think they're going to have the results or the numbers, to be able to get into one of those spots. I think their win percentage may end up being pretty high, but outside of that, their numbers on strength of schedule might be a little bit lower than what's necessary to get in there. In the ASC too, like I think we thought, expected, and again, there's a lot of season left. ETBU to be a little bit higher than they ended up being, but they were another team that needed to replace a lot, and they're going to have some of that turnover there. In Texas Dallas, same way in terms of they're trying to figure out everything there too. So if the ASC only has 2 teams, I think it makes Mary Hardin Baylor's games against Hardin Simmons that much more important. But at the same time, I think the top 5 feel like pretty close to locks at this point, within the way everything's shaping up and what we've seen of these Region 10 teams at this point.
Yeah, the Northwest Conference is a tricky one for me. I think they're all decent. There's a really good middle pack that's decent, and like we saw last night, Willamette beat Whitman, and who consistently can win, I think will be key, and not having this logjam of everybody beating everybody, because that's going to really hurt the conference in the regional ranks.
Right.
Yeah, like it's not that George Fox, Willamette, Pack Lutheran, or Linfield are bad.
Yeah.
But if you want to be a Pool C team, you really can't be. Maybe you get one loss against everybody else in the conference besides the top couple. But yeah, I mean, the Northwest Conference did do very well in non-conference. They won 56% of their non-conference games, which is pretty well above average. And so that's why you can see all their SOSs. They booked strong in non-conference and did well against them. And so all of their SOSs are above, that 540, 550 range, which is pretty good for an entire conference. I don't know how big that conference is. It must not be massive if their SOS numbers are all big. Maybe 10 teams, maybe 9.
Yeah, I think right around there, because you got some of those, Lewis and Clark in there, and Whitworth.
9.
9.
Yeah, so having 16 league games can really help get your SOS away from 500 if the teams book well at a non-conference. So that's Region 10. That's all of my table of contents. But the floor is open. We didn't tell anyone we were doing this, so I don't think we got any questions. But any thoughts that you wanted to bring up as we are a third of the way, probably more, about a third of the way into the season, or anything that we touched on?
I just think, at this point in the year, Scott, it's, as I work to file my top 25 ballot tonight, tomorrow morning, it's been interesting to see the quality of the results that we've had, but also just the complete parity in a way, with some of these teams, losing games. In fact, I looked back through my ballot last week, and there's teams from about 11 to 20 where it feels like anybody can be in any order. And some of these teams took losses that are going to have to drop them. You have to drop them back a little bit based on what you saw. So it is interesting to see at this point in the year. It feels like somewhat early for us to be kind of having these weeks where, a team will go out and lose a game we didn't expect them to lose, but then again, they go on Saturday and win a big game. So I think we're seeing some of this parity, both in non-conference and early on in conference. That's been made it very interesting, I guess, to follow this division as a whole this year, because some of these cross-division matchups have been impactful as well. And I've said this before, but I think there's a lot of games that are being played right now that have been played the last couple of weeks that we're going to be talking about come February and come Selection Monday that are going to be impactful. And we're going to be able to point to and say, that was a pretty deciding result at that point. So credit to these teams for going out and scheduling tough, and it's been fun to watch it all.
And I think these teams would rather end up on Selection Sunday pointing to a loss against a good team in November that kept them out, rather than a win against a bad team that kept them out because they didn't schedule stronger. I don't know how many cases there are going to be of a team that's scheduled too strong. And if they had scheduled 1 to 3 easier games and won them all, they would be in. Like, there's always, to me, way fewer of those occurrences. Like maybe Rochester ends up that way, or Emory. But usually it's a team that, you won 80% of your games, but with too low of an SOS. And we just, you never really got regionally ranked high and didn't consider you. And if this year they went out and they booked Puget Sound, or they booked MIT, or they booked Illinois Wesleyan, you really take matters into your own hands and give yourself a shot.
I think going off of how this thing started, the cross-region matchups that we have coming up before conference season starts are awesome, and I think going to be talked about when teams. I mean, these will be Pool A teams, but it could be hosting opportunities. Gustavus Rhode Island College will play. Wartburg Whitman will play. Stoughton Trine are playing. Whitewater continues their slate against Messiah and Wheaton. It'll be really cool to see some of these cross-region matchups, Riley, like you said, but also the big dogs playing the big dogs.
Yep.
I should put together a list of cross-region games against top, 30 resume teams, and just see how many that we're going to have, especially over the holidays, when a good bulk of the teams are traveling.
Yeah, all those tournaments will definitely jump that number up.
Well, sweet.
When you go to those tournaments, you have the choice to play. A lot of times, the choice to play a weaker schedule or harder. So they're saying harder, and good for them. It's fun from a fan perspective now.
Right.
It totally is. And looking at a lot of those Puerto Rico matchups, I have no idea what kind of leeway or choice teams have, but there are a lot of really, really good matchups there. Mm-hmm. That's super exciting. I had a sum up in my head and now it's gone. But it's been great following the division this year. I think the games are super exciting. I hope that my stats are bringing some color to how important a lot of these early season matchups are. And I don't know. I think while it might seem complicated how teams can get into the NCAA tournament, we've heard committee members, I think Sarah on the men's side, talk about how it's like, if you're paying attention, it's fairly predictable. And, us amateurs on Hoopsville have gotten most of them right. And so I think anything we can do to show a coach or make it easier for a coach or a parent to see, like, it's quite understandable, and it's not just names being picked out of a hat. I think it makes it increasingly easier on coaches to put together the kind of schedule that they need to put together. I know that there's a men's coach that has dropped hints that they've put together a crazy hard schedule for next year. And I think they could be looking towards like how important it might be for a strong team that they think they might have to have a really strong schedule. And the more certainty you have over how aspects of your schedule are going to be valued, the more that you can have that choice, which I think is great, even with the variability and unpredictability of how good teams are going to be 1 and 2 years out into the future when you might be booking them. I think it feels fairly predictable what you need to do to get into the tournament. And I think that's a good thing. I don't know if as a coach you ever dealt with unpredictability in that sort of thing. That would be frustrating. But it would drive me absolutely insane. I'd be like, hey, you told me the goal. I thought I knew the goalposts. I hit them and the goalposts had moved, and that would be really tough.
You just got to follow your website. That's it.
So, yeah. And I've already had one team talk to me about, hey, what kind of schedule can we put together next year? We've got two open slots. Would this team help us, or would that team help us? And I think it's a smart thing to do if you have certain aspirations. And we're definitely focused on the teams that are trying to, win as many games and be the best in Division III as they can. That's not the goal of every team, right? And there's 20, 30 odd goals that every single program is going to have that they measure success by. But if winning as many games and making the NCAA tournament is one of your goals, there's so much that you can optimize for in scheduling. And I've even heard of competing coaches and bunches of coaches in the same conference talking about what are things that we can alter and work together to alter to help all of us out. Because in general, a top team playing a top team benefits both, even though one wins and one loses. I think almost the only time that it wouldn't benefit both is if one team is going to have very few RRO games and this one gives them an extra one. That might be just about the only time. But I've heard teams say like, hey, I don't want to travel to this other team's gym and probably lose. And it's like almost all the time it's going to help you if you have aspirations of being in the tournament. But it's been fun to follow. I love Riley has such a journalistic take on everything. Following all the schools, the newsletter, the book, all kinds of stuff. It's great. And then Justin is just like adding all of this basketball experience and now just kind of throwing yourself into both the like mini journalism on Twitter and then the stat stuff as well. I think it's great to have a body of people following. And, you know, I'm hopeful for like students to start getting interested and start doing stuff within their own school or their own conference or their own region. I think that would be sweet. Because when I was a student, I had no idea about any of this stuff. I would just wait for the press release and, oh, that's the NCAA tournament host that I got to find a ride to for the next game. But yeah, it's all fun.
Yeah, I'll just throw in really quickly, Justin. I mentioned this to Justin last night, but it's been great. You know, for so long, the men's side of Division III, we've had Bob Quillman and the Snyder brothers and, you know, Ryan Whitnibble and Ryan Scott and Pat Coleman and Dave McHugh and all these guys who have such a knowledge base on the men's side. And certainly some of them have also done great things for the women's side, but it's been cool to kind of create and be a part of this Division III women's basketball community that's doing a similar thing and providing this coverage and, you know, putting out our top 25 ballots. You know, Scott's been great, seeing your ballot each week out there. And it's definitely, I think, you know, from the feedback I've heard from people, they've enjoyed it. They've enjoyed having some additional coverage on the women's side because there are great teams and great programs and great coaches and student athletes here. And it's been really cool to just give them, you know, some more attention for all they're accomplishing.
It's fun to talk about because we all learn stuff. You know, I think that's why I love posting my ballot. And because, you know, Bob Quillman tweets out his ballot and gets questions. And then people can go back and forth about like, what is the value of a head-to-head win? Should it like, you know, block that team from being ranked ahead of you for how long? What amount of other results, you know, can flip that? I think that's all really, you know, we're just basketball fans saying like, what do we want to matter? And there's not these clear right and wrong things. And you always just learn more by talking about it. You know, when I put together my ballot, you know, I'm looking at these stats, but I'm also looking at, you know, am I way off on a team? I love looking at Ryan Scott's ballot. I saw Catholic and I was like, what are you doing? And then I started digging in and I was like, oh, like I probably overlooked Catholic. And that kind of stuff is just super useful to me because there's so many teams, so many pieces of data. It's nice to hear about a player missing a game or a key newcomer or someone points out, hey, they've won 3 straight road games against decent teams. It all just helps you be a more knowledgeable fan and add more context to the games that you're watching.
Yeah, I thought you guys did a crazy awesome job last year in just exposing more of D3 basketball, and I'm excited to be along for part of that, but also excited just to watch other teams outside Loris play. So I appreciate what you guys do. It's awesome, and it's a lot of games to watch and cover. So kudos.
Yeah. And with that, I have no idea when our next show will be, but probably will be before February, but maybe sometime in January, we'll try to get another one out. It seems to be about a good cadence, huh, Riley? Like 4 a year. All right. Well, thanks, Justin. Thanks, Riley. And thanks anyone who's been watching. Catch you later.